Okay, welcome. It is May 4th. Welcome to Weekly Marx. We're continuing where we sort of left off last week with Chapter 23, the Princeton edition of the 2024 edition of Karl Marx's Capital, Volume 1. The general law of capitalist accumulation. We left off at Section 4. At some moment, it turns into a lot of tabular data, and I think I might shift actually to the Ed George notes just simply because it gives a better overview. You can read the tables at your leisure, but I will try and keep to most of Marx's text because, after all, when this was written, it was very contemporary. It was doing pretty more empirical work, and in terms of giving uh, recent empirical data. So one should treat it sort of as such. That remember that Marx is giving the kind of basis on which you would, go out and read your manifesto, whatever. The proof of that there are the impoverished, the exploited, um, the immiserated, and I think that that's really important to remember. Number 4, the relative surplus population in its various forms of existence, the general law of capitalist accumulation. The relative surplus population exists in different gradations, with workers belonging to it whenever they are semi-employed or not employed at all. It isn't necessary to go into great detail here. Some general remarks will suffice. The form of the surplus population varies periodically during the alternating phases of the industrial cycle. It takes on its acute form in crisis moments and its chronic form when there is stagnation. However, it always has the following 3 forms: fluid, latent, and stagnant. We've seen how factory workers are alternately repelled and attracted again in greater numbers, with the result that, on the whole, the number of them employed increases in absolute terms, even as it continuously decreases relative to the scale of production. In this case, the surplus population exists in its fluid form. Readers should note 2 circumstances. In both factories proper and large workshops where machinery functions as one factor, or the production process hasn't advanced beyond the modern division of labor, many male workers are used only until they reach adulthood. At this point, just a few stay on, continuing to be employed in the same branches of industry. Many of these workers are therefore always being pushed out of their jobs. They make up part of the fluid surplus population, a part that grows as industry does. Some emigrate or, in fact, merely follow capital that has emigrated. A further consequence is that the female working population increases faster than its male counterpart, as it has in England. The contradiction that the natural growth of the surplus population doesn't suffice for capital's accumulation needs, yet at the same time exceeds what can be absorbed, arises from the very movement of capital, which requires large numbers of young workers and not nearly as many adults. But this contradiction is no more pronounced than another one, that while many thousands of workers are put out in the street because the division of labor chained them to a particular branch of industry, capitalists lament the lack of available hands. Furthermore, capital consumes labor power so fast that it has drained the worker's vitality by the time he reaches the halfway point of his life. He thus winds up in the ranks of the surplus population, or he tumbles from a higher station to a lower one. Meanwhile, capital replaces him with a fresher bearer of labor power. The absolute growth of the working class requires a form that drives up the number of its members, even as they are rapidly worn out. A generation of workers enters the workforce and is, in this way, quickly succeeded by the next one. This law doesn't hold for the other classes. Early marriages, a necessary consequence of the living conditions of industrial workers, help bring about their replenishment, as does the incentive to reproduce that workers have whatever children are exploited to. The moment capitalist production takes control of agriculture, or insofar as it does that, the demand for a population of agricultural workers drops in absolute terms as the capital functioning here accumulates. Workers are repelled, but in contrast to what happens in non-agricultural industries, they aren't subsequently attracted in even greater numbers. So, one part of the rural population is always on the way to being transformed into part of the urban or manufacturing population. In the present context, manufacturing refers to all non-agricultural industries, and the relative surplus population issues from this source continuously. But such a constant stream itself presupposes that in rural areas there always exists a latent surplus population whose full extent we can see only in those rare moments when its outlet channels are wide open. As a result, the rural worker's wages are depressed to the minimum level as he always stands with one foot already submerged in the mire of pauperism. The stagnant surplus population makes up part of the army of active workers, but without having regular employment, or rather anything close to that. Here, then, capital has at its disposal a huge amount of latent labor power. In its life circumstances, this surplus population languishes below the normal level for members of the working class, and for just this reason, it serves as a broad foundation for capital's special branches of exploitation. What characterizes it is that it spends the maximum amount of time working for a minimum of wages. Earlier, we discussed the chief form of this population under the heading domestic industry. Its members are continuously recruited from the ranks of the workers in large-scale industry and agriculture, who have been made, quote-unquote, redundant, and especially from the dying branches of industry where craft labor has succumbed to the manufacturing workshop, and the manufacturing workshop has succumbed to machine-driven production. When more workers are made redundant as the extent and energy of accumulation increase, the stagnant surplus population grows. But it is also a self-reproducing and self-perpetuating element of the working class that contributes a proportionally greater part to that class's total growth than the other elements do. In fact, not only is the combined numbers of births and deaths inversely proportional to wages, and thus the amount of the means of subsistence that various kinds of workers have at their disposal, the absolute size of their families is as well. The law of capitalist society would seem absurd to savages and even civilized colonists. It brings to mind the mass reproduction of animals that are weak on their own and often wind up as prey. Lastly, the most downtrodden members of the relative surplus population reside in the sphere of pauperism. Aside from vagabonds, criminals, prostitutes, or in short, the lumpen proletariat proper, this sphere is inhabited by three categories of people. First, those who are fit to work. One has only to skim through the statistics on English poverty to see that membership in this category swells whenever a crisis takes place and recedes whenever business picks up again. Second, orphans and the children of paupers who are candidates for the Industrial Reserve Army. In times of great prosperity, in 1860, for example, they are quickly and widely called up into the army of active workers. Third, people who are beaten down, worn out, or unfit to work. Often they are workers undone by the hardening and inflexibility that result from the division of labor. Workers who have lived past a worker's normal life expectancy, and the victims of industry, a group that has grown larger as dangerous machinery, mines, and chemical factories have become bigger and proliferated. That is, mutilated workers, chronically ill ones, widows, and so on. Pauperism represents the sick house of the active army of workers and the dead weight of the Industrial Reserve Army. It is produced along with the members of the surplus population, and its necessity is implied by their, by their necessity. That is, capitalist production requires both pauperism and the surplus population. Nor will capitalist wealth develop without them. Pauperism counts among the faux frais of capitalist production that capital manages to largely maneuver onto the backs of members of the working class and the petty bourgeoisie. The greater society's wealth, the greater the functioning capital. The extent and energy of that capital's growth, and thus also the absolute size of the working population and labor's productive power, the larger the surplus population or industrial army will be. The same things that increase capital's power to expand also cause the disposable labor power to increase. Thus, the proportional magnitude of the industrial reserve army grows as the potency of wealth does. But the greater this reserve army is in proportion to the army of active workers, the more massive the consolidated surplus population, whose misery stands in inverse relation to the amount of labor its members have to suffer through. Finally, the greater the immiserated sections of the working class and the greater the industrial reserve army, the greater the amount of official pauperism will be. This is the absolute general law of capitalist accumulation. As with all other laws, various circumstances modify it as it is realized, but we don't need to analyze that process here. Readers will recognize the folly of the economic wisdom behind preaching to workers that they should adapt their numbers to fit capital's valorization needs. The mechanism of capitalist production and accumulation constantly sees to it that the one thing accords with the other. The alpha of this process of adapting is that a relative surplus population or industrial reserve army is created. Its omega is the misery brought forth when the strata of the active army of workers keep increasing, and also the dead weight of pauperism. As for the law that when labor's social productive power increases, the amount of labor power to be expended is progressively reduced relative to the amount and effectiveness of the means of production, when this law operates in a capitalist context where the worker doesn't employ means of labor but is instead employed by them, it is expressed as follows. The greater labor's productive power, the more pressure workers put on their means of employment, and in turn, the more precarious the condition of the wage laborer's existence becomes. Namely, he has to sell his labor power to increase someone else's wealth or bring about capital's self-valorization. That the means of production and labor's productive power increase faster than the productive population is thus expressed the other way around under capitalist production. In other words, as the fact that the working population always increases faster than capital's valorization needs. In part 4 of this book, where we analyzed how relative surplus value is produced, we saw that all methods for increasing labor's social productive power in its capitalist form are implemented only at the individual worker's expense. All the means for developing production turn into different ways to dominate and exploit the producer. These means deform the worker, making him into a partial human being, leaving him degraded, a mere appendage of the machine. They also destroy the substance of labor as they recast his work as torture. They alienate the worker from the intellectual powers needed for the labor process, doing so in proportion to the extent to which science is incorporated into that process as an independent power, and they make the circumstances in which the worker works more and more abnormal, subject him to a hateful, supremely petty despotism during the labor process, turn his lifetime into labor time, and thrust his wife and children under the wheels of the juggernaut that is capital. But all the methods for producing surplus value are also methods for bringing about accumulation. And every time accumulation increases, this is, at the same time, a means of further developing those very methods. It follows that, however well or poorly a worker is paid, his situation becomes worse in proportion to capital's accumulation. Finally, the law that always maintains the equilibrium between the relative surplus population or industrial reserve army and the extent and energy of accumulation welds the worker to capital more tightly than Hephaestus's wedges bound Prometheus to the rock. This law requires an accumulation of misery that corresponds to the accumulation of capital. So the accumulation of wealth on one side of the capital relation is simultaneously the accumulation of misery, torturous labor, slavery, ignorance, brutality, and moral degradation on the opposite side, where we find the class whose own product is produced as capital. Political economists have formulated this, i.e., the adversarial character of capitalist accumulation in a variety of ways, but they've also lumped it together with other phenomena that, while somewhat ambiguous, differ from it fundamentally since they belong to pre-capitalist modes of production. The Venetian monk Ortis, one of the greatest economic writers of the 18th century, took the adversarial character of capitalist production to be a universal, natural law of social wealth. Quote, the economic good and bad in a nation always equal out. Il bene e il male economico in una nazione sempre alla stessa misura. The abundance of goods for some is always equal to the lack of goods for others. The great wealth of a few is always accompanied by an absolute robbery committed against many more people, who thus go without life's necessities. A nation's wealth corresponds to its population, and its misery corresponds to its wealth. The industry of some forces idleness upon others. The rich and the active bring about as a necessary product the poor and the idle, etc. About a decade after Ortiz, Joseph Townsend, a high church Protestant parson, cruelly glorified poverty as a necessary condition of wealth. Quote, legal constraint to perform labor is attended with too much trouble, violence, and noise, whereas hunger is not only a peaceable, silent, unremitted pleasure, but as the most natural motive to industry and labor, it calls forth the most powerful exertions. The crucial thing then, unquote, the crucial thing then is to make hunger permanent for members of the working class, and what sees to that, according to Townsend, is the population principle, which operates with particular force among the poor. Quote, it seems to be a law of nature that the poor should be, to a certain degree, improvident, i.e., so improvident that to be born without silver spoons in their mouths, that there may always be some to fulfill the most servile, the most sordid, and the most ignoble offices in the community. The stock of human happiness is thereby much increased, whilst the more delicate are not only relieved from drudgery, but are left at liberty, without interruption, to pursue those callings which are suited to their various dispositions. The poor law tends to destroy the harmony and beauty, the symmetry and order of that system which God and nature have established in the world, unquote. Quote, the progress of social wealth, unquote, wrote Storch, quote, gives rise to this useful class of society which takes charge of the most tedious, the most vile, and the most disgusting occupations, in a word, which takes on itself all that is unpleasant and servile in life, and provides other classes time, serenity of mind, and conventional, c'est bon, dignity of character, unquote. Storch then asked himself, what makes capitalist civilization, which has brought so much misery and degraded the masses, preferable to barbarism? He could think of only one thing: security. Quote, because of the advances in industry and the sciences, says Sismondi, quote, every worker can produce every day more and ever more than he has need to consume, but at the same time that his labor produces wealth, that wealth, if he were to enjoy it, would make him less fit to work, unquote. Poor nations, observes de Tracy, quote, are where the people are comfortable, and rich ones are where they are generally poor. Section 5, illustrations of the general law of capitalist accumulation. A, England from 1846 to 1866. For the purpose of studying capitalist accumulation, no time in modern society is as propitious as the past 20 years. It is as if we discovered a Fortunatus's purse. But among all countries, England again stands out as our classic example. Not only is it the leader in the world market, capitalist production is fully developed here and nowhere else. Moreover, when the millennium of free trade was launched in 1846, vulgar political economy was left without a place to hide. The account given in Part 4 of this book should suffice to evoke the enormous advances in production that were made between 1846 and 1866. They were such that the productivity of the second decade far outpaced that of the first. Although England's population has grown a great deal in absolute terms over the past 50 years, relative population growth, or the rate of growth, has fallen continuously. We can see this by looking at the following table, which comes from the official census. It's the annual rate of population growth in England and Wales over 10-year periods. It goes from 1811 to 21 at 1.533% to 1851 to 61 at 1.141%. Let's now consider how much wealth has increased. The most reliable index is the movement of ground rent and other profits subject to being taxed as income. In Great Britain, the growth of taxable profits between 1853 and 1864, not including the ones made in farming and a few other areas, amounted to 50.47%, or an annual average of 4.58%, while the population grew by about 12% during the same period. The growth of taxable rents on land, including houses, railways, mines, fisheries, and so on, amounted to 38%, or 3 and 5/12 annually. The largest increases occurred in the following categories, and it's a table with percentage by which the annual income of 1864 exceeds the annual income of 1853, with a percentage increase per year that ranges from 3.5 to 11.45. In houses, quarries, mines, ironworks, fisheries, gasworks, and railways. When we divide the years from 1853 to 64 into three segments of 4 consecutive years, we see that the rate at which incomes grew accelerated continuously. Incomes stemming from profits increased at 1.73% per year between 1853 and 57, 2.74% between 1857 and 61, 9.3% between 61 and 64. In 1856, the total amount of taxable income in the United Kingdom came out to 307,067,898 pounds. In 1859, it was 328,127,416. In 62, 351 million pounds. 63, 359 million. 64, 362 million. And in 1865, it was 385,350,020 pounds. As capital accumulated, it also became more concentrated. Although there were no official statistics recorded for English agriculture, there were for agriculture in Ireland, however. 10 counties provided them voluntarily. What they show is that between 1851 and 61, the number of farms with fewer than 100 acres fell from 31,000 to 26,000, which means that 5,000 of them were taken over by larger farms. Between 1815 and 25, not a single personal estate of more than a million pounds was taxed under the estate tax, but between 1825 and 1855, 8 such estates were, and from 1855 to 59, in just 4.5 years, 4 additional states were. This process of concentration will become even clearer, however, if we briefly analyze the income tax Schedule D, that is, profits excluding farms, for the years 1864 and 65. Let me note in advance that only income beyond 60 pounds was subject to this tax. So, in 1864, the taxable income amounted to 95 million plus pounds in England, Scotland, and Wales, while the number of people who paid income tax was 308,000. Out of a total population of 23 million. The sums for 1865 were 105 million and 332,000 out of 24 million. The following tables show how these incomes were distributed in both years. So it is increasing, needless to say. And without reeling off these numbers, after seeing These few examples, the readers should be able to make sense of the victory cry emitted by England's Registrar General. Rapidly as the population has increased, as it has not kept pace with the progress of industry and wealth. Let us now turn to the direct agents in this industry, the actual producers of this wealth, the members of the working class. Quote, "It is one of the most melancholy features in the social state of the country," said Gladstone, "that while there was a decrease in the consuming powers of the people and an increase in the privations and distress of the laboring and operative classes, there was at the same time a constant accumulation of wealth in the upper classes and a constant increase of capital," unquote. These were the words spoken by that unctuous minister when he addressed the House of Commons on February 13th, 1843. Now, introducing his budget 20 years later on April 16th, 1863, he said, from 42 to 52, the taxable income in the country increased by 6%. In 8 years, from 1853 to 1861, it had increased from the basis in 1853 by 20%. The fact is so astonishing as to be almost incredible. This intoxicating augmentation of wealth and power is entirely confined to classes of property. But that augmentation must be of indirect benefit to the laboring population because it cheapens the commodities of general consumption. While the rich have been growing richer, the poor have been growing less poor. At any rate, whether the extremes of poverty are less, I do not presume to say, unquote. What a sorry anticlimax. If the members of the working class have remained, quote unquote, poor, only, quote unquote, less poor in proportion to the intoxicating augmentation of wealth and power they produce for members of the wealthy class, then they have remained just as poor in relative terms. If the extremes of poverty haven't decreased, then they have increased because the extremes of wealth have. As for the idea that the means of subsistence have become less expensive, the official statistics, such as the figures from the London Orphan Asylum, show that those means became more expensive by 20% between 1853 and 1862, a figure we arrive at by comparing the average of the years 1851 to 53 with the average of the last 3 years, 60 to 62. The next 3 years, 1863 to 65, saw prices for a variety of staples rise progressively: meat, butter, salt, milk, coal, and so on. The budget speech Gladstone gave on April 7th, 1864, was a Pindaric dithyramb to the progress achieved in profit-making and a popular happiness tempered by poverty. He spoke of masses of people being on the border of pauperism and of branches of industry where wages have not increased. And finally, he summed up the happiness of the working class with the phrase, quote, "Human life is but, in 9 cases out of 10, a struggle for existence," unquote. Not constrained by his office in the way Gladstone was, Professor Fawcett flatly declared, quote, "I do not, of course, deny that money wages have been augmented by this increase of capital over the past decades, but this apparent advantage is to a great extent lost because many of the necessaries of life are becoming dearer, which he believes is the case because the value of precious metals has fallen. The rich grow rapidly richer, whilst there is no perceptible advance in the comfort enjoyed by the industrial classes. They, the workers, become almost the slaves of the tradesmen to whom they owe money," unquote. The working day and machinery sections of this book have familiarized readers with the conditions that members of the British working class have had to contend with over the past 10 years, during which they produced a quote, intoxicating augmentation of wealth and power, unquote, for the property classes. However, our chief concern in those sections was to show the workers' plight during the actual production process. And if we want to gain a thorough understanding of the law of capitalist accumulation, we have to spend some time considering how the worker lives outside that process, what he eats, and the state of his home. Because space is, of course, limited here, we will have to focus on the worst paid industrial and agricultural workers who together make up the majority of the working class. First, a word about official paupers. They are the members of the working class who have forfeited selling their labor power, which is how workers exist and waste away on public alms. In 1855, there were 851,369 people on England's official pauper list. On 1856, the list contains 1877,000, and in 65, 970,000. The cotton famine caused the ranks of the paupers to swell in 1863 and 64, and the list grew to have respectively 1,079,000 and 1,014,000 people. The crisis of 1866 was at its most devastating in London, the capital of the world market, a city with more people than there are in the entire Kingdom of Scotland, and the number of paupers rose there by 19.5% as compared with the total in 1865, and by 24.4% as compared with the total in 1864. The first months of 1867 saw an even greater increase over the total during the corresponding period in 1866. As we analyze these statistics, we should pay special attention to 2 points. On the one hand, the fluctuating size of the pauper list does in fact reflect the periodic alternations of the industrial cycle. On the other hand, the official pauper statistics become more and more misleading as an index of actual pauperism in proportion to the extent to which class conflict, and thus the worker's sense of self, develops when the accumulation of capital advances. The barbaric treatment of paupers that has moved the English press to loudly protest over the past 2 years, for example, the Times, Pall Mall, and the Gazette, is old news. In 1844, Friedrich Engels documented the very same horrors and the very same outrage fleetingly voiced by quote-unquote sensational literature. Yet over the past 10 years, deaths by starvation in London have risen frightfully, and this should eliminate all doubts as to the increasing disgust that the slavery of the workhouse, that penal institution for the poor, elicits in workers. Section B, the poorly paid strata of Britain's industrial working class. Let us now turn to the poorly paid strata of the industrial working class. During the cotton famine, or in 1862, the Privy Council tasked Dr. Smith with investigating the diet of impoverished cotton workers in Lancashire and Cheshire. Years of observation had led him to conclude that, quote, to avert starvation diseases, unquote, the food an average woman eats each day must contain at least 3,900 grains of carbon and 180 grains of nitrogen, while a man has to consume food containing at least 4,300 grains of carbon and 200 grains of nitrogen. For a woman, this amounts to the nutrients in 2 pounds of good wheat bread, and for a man to 1/9 more than that. So during an average week, adult men and women must consume at least 28.6 thousand grains of carbon and 1.3 thousand grains of nitrogen. Dr. Smith could not have expected that in December 1862, the cotton famine would reduce the weekly intake of cotton workers to the following paltry amount: 29,211 grains of carbon and 1,295 grains of nitrogen, thereby supplying practical confirmation of his earlier calculations. In 1863, the Privy Council decided to investigate the dire state of the worst nourished members of England's working class, and Dr. Simon, the council's medical officer, chose the above-mentioned Dr. Smith to conduct a study. The scope of his inquiry encompassed agricultural workers, silk weavers, needlewomen, kid glove makers, stocking makers, glove weavers, and shoemakers. With the exception of stocking making and, of course, agricultural work, all these jobs are practiced exclusively in towns. As a matter of policy, Dr. Smith examined the healthiest families in each category and the ones that enjoyed comparatively good circumstances. The general finding was that in only one of the examined classes of indoor operatives did the average nitrogen supply just exceed, while in another it nearly reached, the estimated standard of bare sufficiency, i.e., to prevent starvation diseases, and that in 2 classes there was a defect, in one a very large defect of both nitrogen and carbon. Moreover, as regards the examined families of the agricultural population, it appeared that more than a fifth were with less than the estimated sufficiency of carbonaceous food, that more than one-third were with less than the estimated sufficiency of nitrogenous food, and that in 3 counties, Berkshire, Oxfordshire, and Somersetshire, insufficiency of nitrogenous food was the average local diet. Unquote. Of the agricultural workers, the ones in England, the wealthiest part of the United Kingdom, were the worst fed. Women and children tended to bear the brunt of the lack of food in agricultural settings because, quote, the man has to eat to do his work, unquote. But even greater food scarcity afflicted the different kinds of workers examined in towns. They, taken as a whole, are so ill-fed that assuredly among them there must be many instances of severe and injurious privation. All this is the capitalist's abstinence. He abstains from paying his hands enough to buy what they need to barely survive. The following table shows the diet of the aforementioned types of workers who work exclusively in towns as compared with both the minimum amount set by Dr. Smith and the amount consumed by cotton workers when their crisis moment was at its most extreme. And this table includes both sexes. The columns are average weekly carbon in grains and average weekly nitrogen in grains. And the 5 indoor occupations, 28,000 to 1,192. Unemployed Lancashire operatives, 28,000 to 1,295. Minimum quantity proposed for Lancashire operatives, equal number of males and females, 28,600 to 1,330. Of the different categories of industrial workers investigated, 60 over 125, or about half, had no beer at all, and 28% went without milk. The weekly per family averages for liquid forms of nourishment ranged from 7 ounces, which is what needlewomen got, to 24 3/4 ounces for the stocking makers. Most of the workers who had no milk were needlewomen in London. The amount of bread consumed each week varied from 7 3/4 pounds needlewomen to 11 1/4 pounds shoemakers, with the overall average per adult being 9.9 pounds. Sugar, that is treacle, etc., amounts ranged from the 4 ounces a week that kid glove makers got to the 11 ounces per week that stocking makers consumed. The overall weekly average for adults was 8 ounces. As for butter, fat, etc., the overall weekly average was 5 ounces per adult. The weekly average of meat, that is bacon, etc., per adult varied from 7 1/4 ounces silk weavers to 18 1/4 ounces kid glove makers, while the overall average was 13.6. The average amount spent weekly to feed an adult worker was as follows. Silk weavers, 2 shillings, 2.5 pence, 2 shillings, needlewomen, 2 shillings, 7 pence, kid glove makers, 2 shillings, 9.5, shoemakers, 2 shillings, 7 3/4, stocking makers, 2 shillings, 6 1/4. The average weekly total for the silk weavers of Macclesfield amounted to only 1 shilling, 8.5 pence. Of all the different kinds of workers examined, the worst fed were the needlewomen, the silk weavers, and the kid glove makers. In his general health report, Dr. Simon has this to say about the workers' food situation, that cases are innumerable in which defective diet is the cause or aggravator of disease, can be affirmed by anyone who is conversant with poor law medical practice or with the wards and outpatient rooms of hospitals. Yet, in this point of view, there is, in my opinion, a very important sanitary context to be added. It must be remembered that privation of food is very reluctantly born, and that, as a rule, great poorness of diet will only come when other privations have preceded it. Long before insufficiency of diet is a matter of hygienic concern, long before the physiologist would think of counting the grains of nitrogen and carbon which intervene between life and starvation, the household will have been utterly destitute of material comfort. Clothing and fuel will have been even scantier than food against inclemencies of weather. There will have been no adequate protection. Dwelling space will have been stinted to the degree in which overcrowding produces or increases disease. Of household utensils and furniture, there will be scarcely any. Even cleanliness will have been found costly or difficult, and if there still be self-respectful endeavors to maintain it, every such endeavor will represent additional pangs of hunger. The home, too, will be where shelter can be cheapest bought in quarters where commonly there is the least fruit of sanitary supervision, least drainage, least scavenging, least suppression of public nuisances, least or worst water supply, and if in town, least light and air. Such are the sanitary dangers to which poverty is almost certainly exposed when it is poverty enough to imply scantiness of food. And while the sum of them is of terrible magnitude against life, the mere scantiness of food is in itself a very serious moment. These are painful reflections, especially when it is remembered that the poverty to which they advert is not the deserved poverty of idleness. In all cases, it is the poverty of working populations. Indeed, as regards the indoor operatives, the work which obtains the scanty pittance of food is for the most part excessively prolonged. Yet evidently it is only in a qualified sense that the work can be deemed self-supporting. On a very large scale, the nominal self-support can be only a circuit longer or shorter to pauperism, unquote. The pangs of hunger suffered by the most industrious strata of workers are intimately linked to capitalist accumulation as well as the overconsumption, whether crude or refined, by the rich that goes with it. But only someone who understands economic laws will be able to recognize this. Not so with living conditions. Any unbiased observer can see that the greater the concentration of the means of production, the greater the corresponding agglomeration of workers in a small amount of space, and thus the more rapid the pace of capitalist accumulation, the more miserable the workers' living conditions. Furthermore, anyone could see that what happens when increased wealth leads to urban improvements. Poorly built neighborhoods are raised and palaces are constructed for banks and warehouses, while streets are widened to make room for commercial traffic, luxury carriages, and tram lines, all of which drives the poor into ever more squalid and oppressive holes. On the other hand, everyone knows that the price of housing is inversely proportional to its quality, and that speculators have exploited the mines of misery for more profit than has ever been extracted from the mines of Potosi. The antagonistic character of capitalist accumulation, and therefore capitalist property relations in general, have become so palpable here that even the official English reports on this topic abound with heretical invectives against quote-unquote property and its rights. This evil has matched strides with the development of industry, the accumulation of capital, and the growth and improvement of towns and cities, so much so that between 1847 and 64, fear of infectious disease, which don't spare even respectable people, led to no less than 10 parliamentary acts having to do with public health, and the terrified citizenry in some cities, for example, Liverpool and Glasgow, pushed the municipal government into taking action. Yet Dr. Simon writes in his report of 1865, quote, generally speaking, in England, these terrible conditions are uncontrolled, unquote. The previous year, the Privy Council ordered that an inquiry be made into the living conditions of agricultural workers. Another one was conducted in 1865, this time into how members of the poorer classes of the cities and towns were living. Readers will find Dr. Julian Hunter's masterful studies in the 7th, 1865, and 8th reports on public health. I will discuss agricultural workers below. As for the living conditions in cities and towns, let me preface my account with a general remark by Dr. Simon. Quote, though my official point of view, he says, is one exclusively physical, common humanity requires that the other aspects of this evil should not be ignored. In its higher degrees, it almost necessarily involves such negation of all delicacy, such unclean confusion of bodies and bodily functions, such mutual exposure of animal and sexual nakedness as is rather bestial than human. To be subject to those influences is a degradation which must become deeper and deeper for those on whom it continues to work. To children who are born under its curse, it must often be a very baptism into infamy, and beyond all measure hopeless is the wish that persons thus circumstanced should ever in other respects other respects aspire to that atmosphere of civilization which has its essence in physical and moral cleanliness, unquote. If cities got a prize for having the most tenements that are overcrowded or otherwise completely unfit for human habitation, London would win it. Quote, 2 points, says Dr. Hunter, are absolutely clear. First, that there are about 20 large colonies in London, of about 10,000 persons each, whose miserable condition exceeds almost anything seen elsewhere in England, and is almost entirely the result of their bad house accommodation. And second, that the crowded and dilapidated condition of the houses of these colonies is much worse than was the case 20 years ago. It is not too much to say that life in parts of London and Newcastle is infernal. In addition, the better off strata of London's working class, small housekeepers, and other members of the lower middle class languish more and more in such terrible housing conditions. They suffer in proportion to the advance of urban improvements and the resulting demolition of old streets and houses, the rapid growth of urban factories and populations, and finally the rise in house rents that goes with rising urban ground rents. Quote, rents have become so heavy that few laboring men can afford more than one room. London has very few house properties that aren't weighed down by a crowd of middlemen because the price of land there is very high relative to the revenue it brings in annually, and every buyer speculates on getting rid of it sooner or later at a jury price, the expropriation valuation set by a jury. Or he speculates on the trick of making off with an amount value that has increased dramatically because of some large-scale undertaking nearby. Thus, the quote-unquote fag ends of leases are regularly bought and sold. Quote, gentlemen in this business may be fairly expected to do as they do, get all they can from the tenants while they have them, and leave as little as they can for their successors. The rents are weekly, and these gentlemen take no risk upon themselves. When railway lines were built in the city, the consequences for workers' living conditions were dire. Quote, the spectacle has lately been seen in the east of London of a number of families wandering about some Saturday night with their scanty, worldly goods on their backs without any resting place but the workhouse, unquote. The workhouses are already overcrowded, and the process of making the improvements sanctioned by Parliament has only just begun. When workers are displaced by the demolition of their homes, some stay in their old parish while others move on to the next one, settling as close as they can to where they used to live. They try, naturally, to stay as near as possible to the places where they work. As a result, they part their two-room tenements into single rooms. Even at an advanced rent, the people who are displaced will hardly be able to get an accommodation so good as the meager one they have left. Half the workmen in the Strand work 2 miles to their work. The same Strand, a main thoroughfare, leaves strangers to London awed by the city's wealth. Yet the area can also give them a sense of how human beings are packed together there. The public health officer calculated the population density in one parish to be 581 persons per acre, even though half the width of the Thames was counted as part of it. Like earlier public health measures in London that involved condemning and leveling unsafe homes, these ones have served only to drive workers from their old districts into new ones where they are crammed together even more than before. Either, says Dr. Hunter, the whole proceeding will of necessity stop as an absurdity, or the public compassion be effectually aroused to the obligation which may now be without exaggeration called national, of supplying cover to those who by reason of their having no capital cannot provide it for themselves, though they can by periodic payments reward those who provide it for them. One has to admire capitalist justice. Landowners, homeowners, and businessmen don't just receive the full value of their lost property when they are expropriated because of urban improvements such as railways and new streets. Having been forced into renouncing, they must also be compensated according to divine and human law with a handsome profit. The worker, for his part, is thrown out into the street with his wife, child, and possessions, and if too many workers crowd into a district where the local officials insist on decency, they will be prosecuted in the name of public health. At the beginning of the 19th century, London was the only city in England where more than 100,000 people lived. Only 5 cities had a population greater than 50,000. Today, England has 28 cities with over 50,000 inhabitants. The result of this change is not only that the class of town people is enormously increased, but that the old, close packed little towns are now centers built round on every side, open nowhere to air, and being no longer agreeable to the rich are abandoned by them for the pleasanter outskirts. The successors of these rich are occupying the larger houses at the rate of a family to each room, and a population for which the houses were not intended and quite unfit has been created, whose surroundings are truly degrading to the adults and ruinous to the children. The faster capital accumulates in a commercial or industrial town, the faster the influx of exploitable human material, which in turn makes the workers' impoverished dwellings all the more terrible. As the center of a coal and mining district whose output keeps increasing, Newcastle upon Tyne takes second place behind London in the housing inferno. No less than 34,000 people reside there in single rooms. The authorities recently demolished a large number of houses in Newcastle and Gateshead, having deemed them a clear danger to the community. The construction of new houses has proceeded slowly, while business has moved very fast. Thus, by 1865, overcrowding blighted the city more than ever. It was nearly impossible to find a room for rent. Dr. Embleton, who works at the Newcastle Fever Hospital, writes, "There can be little doubt that the great cause of the continuance and spread of the typhus has been the overcrowding of human beings and the uncleanliness of their dwellings. The rooms in which laborers in many cases live are situated in confined and unwholesome yards or courts, and for space, light, air, and cleanliness are models of insufficiency and insalubrity, and a disgrace to any civilized community. In them, men, women, and children lie at night huddled together, and as regards the men, the night shift succeeded the day shift, and the day shift the night shift in unbroken series for some time together, the beds having scarcely time to cool. The whole house badly supplied with water, and worse, with privies, dirty, unventilated, and pestiferous. The weekly price for such squalid holes ranges from 8 pence to 3 pence. The town of Newcastle on Tyne, remarks Dr. Hunter, contains a sample of the finest tribe of our countrymen, often sunk by external circumstances of house and street into an almost savage degradation. The living conditions in an industrial town might be bearable today, but awful tomorrow because of how capital and labor ebb and flow. It can also happen that the town's magistrates finally resolve to deal with the worst situations, and then the next day, bedraggled Irishmen or worn-out English agricultural workers come swarming in like locusts. They're stowed away in cellars or lofts, and a formerly respectable workers' house is turned into a hostel that people move into and out of as fast as soldiers quartered during the 30 Years' War. Consider, for example, the town of Bradford. The municipal Philistines there had just tried to improve their town, which in 1861 still had 1,751 unoccupied homes. Then business picked up, prompting Mr. Forster, a gentle liberal and friend of the Negro, to crow so artfully. And of course, with the revival of business came waves of the reserve army, or relative surplus population, which keeps surging and receding, and the town was flooded with people. It was mostly well-paid workers who wound up living in the frightful cellar apartments and rooms that an insurance agent compiled a list of for Dr. Hunter. These workers declared that they would gladly paid for better lodgings if any had been available. Instead, they wilted, becoming sickly and haggard. Meanwhile, Forster, that gentle liberal and also an MP, shed tears of joy over the blessings of free trade and the profits that the eminences of Bradford made in the worsted industry. In his report of September 5, 1865, Dr. Bell, one of the local poor law doctors, blamed the housing conditions for the appalling mortality rates among the fever patients in his district. Quote, "In one small cellar measuring 1,500 cubic feet, there are 10 persons. Vincent Street, Green Air Place, and the Lays, which include 223 houses having 1,450 inhabitants, 453 beds, and 36 privies. The beds, and in that term I include any roll of dirty old rags or an armful of shavings, have an average of 3.3 persons to each. Some have 4 to 6 persons each, and many people are absolutely without beds. They sleep in the ordinary clothes on the bare boards, young men and women, married and unmarried, all together. I need scarcely add that many of these dwellings are damp, dark, dirty, stinking holes, utterly unfit for human habitations. They are the centers from which disease and death are distributed amongst those in better circumstances who have allowed them thus to fester in our midst." The housing misery in Bristol is bad enough to rank third behind London. Bristol, where the blankest poverty and domestic misery abound in the wealthiest town in Europe. Uh, yes. Well, I think I'm going to stop there because undoubtedly the privations of humanity have set in. I will make an attempt to complete all this reading perhaps next week. We will see whether we go ahead or behind. In the intervening time, I might actually attempt to read Ed George's notes to give a better summary of all this because there's a tremendous number of tables of tabular information that come subsequently. And let me look at the editor's notes, and then we can conclude.
It's
As
so
I
nice to
see,
know that Newcastle and Bradford are going back to those lovely ways,
bloody hell,
isn't it? 100 people to a house, all that
indeed.
sort of shit.
Well,
Mm,
this was a nearly contemporaneous report, so you can see people hopefully would become outraged.
yeah.
Okay, the editor's notes, chapter 23, the general law of capitalist accumulation, lowercase Roman numeral 1. Sir Frederick Morton Eden was an English noble and chairman of the Globe Insurance Company in London. As an economist, he was a follower of Adam Smith and a qualified liberal who nonetheless advocated some state intervention, especially on behalf of the workless poor. Eden wrote that the major compendium of information on the English poor in 3 volumes, The State of the Poor, 1797. The book contains unvarnished portraits of the workhouses to which these populations were assigned and gave impetus for the revised poor laws of the early and mid-19th century, which sent impoverished people out to work for the lowest wages. Number 2, in Roman law, a peculium was a piece of property legally owned by the master or the father, but practically in the possession of the slave or the son. Number 3, ceteris paribus is a Latin phrase meaning under conditions that are otherwise equal, or as we contemporary call it, all things being equal. Number 4, in the third 1883 and fourth 1890 editions of Capital, Engels added a footnote here. The note reproduces a handwritten observation in Marx's own copy of the text, the upshot of which is that with a merely quantitative extension, larger and larger amounts of capital in the same branch of industry will yield profits that correspond to the capital advanced. If the quantitative extension results in a quantitative change, then for the larger capital, the rate of profit will increase. Number 5, le son pipe is a French expression meaning the dice are loaded. Number 6, this quotation, which Marx first used in 1864 in his inaugural address for the International Working Men's Association, prompted a debate that went on for decades. At issue was whether Marx had falsified, i.e., invented part of it. That is what the left-leaning political economist Lucio Bertano charged him with anonymously in 1872. As we can see in Capital, Marx attributed to Gladstone the line, "This intoxicating augmentation of wealth and power entirely confined to classes of property," unquote. And in, quote, "How Karl Marx Quotes," unquote, which appeared in the industry magazine Concordia, Bertano asserted that, quote, "Marx made up this sentence, both its form and content," unquote. Not one to de-escalate, Marx rejected the accusation in strong terms, calling his unnamed accuser an ass, unquote. Writing in the Social Democratic newspaper Der Volksstaat, he pointed out that important circumstances had gone unmentioned. For one thing, Gladstone had had the opportunity to edit the version of the speech cited by Marx's critic. For another, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, Gladstone had plenty of motivation to excise a remark about England's growing class divide. Marx could have helped himself by producing the original source he had relied on for the quotation, but he failed to do that. Instead, he referred readers to newspaper transcriptions of the speech that included the sentence on which the debate turned. And thus, nearly 20 years later, Engels devoted much of his preface in the fourth edition of Capital, 1890, to an attempt to vindicate Marx in the Gladstone affair. We can see that, fake news existed even then. Number 7, the grain as a standard of measure grew out of the long-standing custom of measuring the mass of cereals, such as wheat, by the individual seed. It became the basis for the English weight system, and although outmoded now, is equivalent to 64.79891 milligrams. Number 8, in the 17th century, the mines of Potosi, located in Bolivia, were among the most lucrative in the world. Number 9, instrumentum vocale is a Latin phrase that means talking tool and referred to slave labor, as opposed to the supposedly mute tools like oxen and hammers. Number 10, from 1830 to 1833, English agricultural workers wrote menacing letters to farmers demanding a say in how new technology was implemented in the fields and also better pay. The signatory of these real letters was the fictional Captain Swing, hence what were known as the Swing Riots, which entailed acts of property destruction as well. Number 11, incarcerated for 3 years for seducing and marrying an underage heiress, Edward Gibbon Wakefield spent his time in prison studying economic conditions, and by extending the scope of his studies, he came to critique the forced population of the colony New South Wales, now part of the nation of Australia, with convicts. This, in turn, led him to concoct a theory of colonization that was both liberal and capitalist. Wakefield insisted that the colonial populations, though not the indigenous peoples they displaced, should govern themselves. But this liberality went hand in hand with a social engineering project for which he developed a theory of systematic colonization. His plan's objective was to reproduce an English milieu through the resettlement of married couples, capitalists, and laborers, and he promoted this plan in the press and appealed to government officials with singular zeal in the face of the apathy of the British public and the protests of actual colonists. His propaganda about New South Wales strongly affected the establishment of the colony New Zealand, our own and gracious land, and was also used to support a massive reform in the colonial structure in Canada. Number 12, Anthony Ashley Cooper. Remember, New Zealand is the first to be called God's country. Anyway, Anthony Ashley Cooper, Earl of Shaftesbury. See the note about Tory philanthropism on page 823 of this volume. Number 13, post tot discrimina rerum is a Latin phrase meaning after so many major turning points. Secundum artem is a Latin phrase meaning according to the rules of art. Number 14, nihil habeo, nihil curo is a Latin phrase meaning I have nothing, I have no worries. Number 15, in the following section, Bedfordshire through Worcestershire, Marx is paraphrasing Public Health 7th Report, 1865. Phanerogamy was Fourier's term for the polyandry that we practice in social society imagined, where the communal unit would replace the family. Oh, those darn socialists. Number 17, Marx is playing off a line from Goethe's Faust, Part 1, which says that it is very nice of a great lord to speak so humanely with the devil himself. Number 18, Aaron is a Celtic phrase for Ireland. 19, the French phrase comme l'appétit vient en mangeant means as appetite comes with eating. Number 20, Fenians were Irish revolutionaries who hoped to throw off the yoke of English rule and turn Ireland into an independent democratic republic. Oh, the movement gained prominence around 1857 and was active in the United States too. 21, from Horace's Epodes 7, quote, a cruel fate and the crime of a brother's murder have driven the Romans on, unquote. Translation is from Horace, Odes and Epidodes. Odes and Epidodes. Anyway, I've included the Ed George notes and the Harry Cleaver notes. And as I said, next week this will give you at least the overview of the entire chapter, and we'll see how far we get next week. We only have 2 more chapters left, so they are longish chapters, needless to say. I think the reasons you can see is that Marx included empirical proof for his statements, and as we can see, relative to this troll Brentano, there's actually a media trouble as a result of it. So that's the length of my yammering today. Global South super exploitation. Indeed, urban division replicated on a global scale. Yes, in fact, that's the center periphery argument writ large in the world. And you don't even have to go world systems theory. They had a Schedule D in 1864. And funny they didn't measure it in terms of carbohydrates and proteins. Remember, thank you, Robert. These are early measurements of stuff in the 19th century. And but dietary nitrogen, because this comes from the issue of measuring nitrogen, soil nitrogen, etc. The chemistry is still early then, and everybody knows the dice are loaded. Indeed, shocked. I'm shocked that gambling is going on here. Let me now put the link in for the article for the chapter, and thank you for your attention, and then return us to your regularly scheduled program at the top of the next hour at 4 o'clock is oh gosh, Star Trek: The Next Generation, an excellent episode actually. It's the beginning of the second season, which has all of its own amusing issues that are worth talking about, that are actually quite controversial. Well, not quite controversial, but I suppose even if you aren't a Trekkie, it's controversial and worth talking about. So I hope that you'll stick around and watch that. Let me thank everyone else for their attention, and I will now stop share and go to stopping live